Wicked for Good is a wonderful musical adaptation, but there's no justice for the wicked. The original film had a lot of nuance, whereas the second installment felt very on the nose in regards to communicating the themes of the story. The opening of Wicked for Good I felt was slower in its pacing. I personally enjoyed the first installment more, mainly because it was lighter. The second installment has darker themes, there's higher stakes, but the first one I think had better songs. Defying Gravity, I think that's really hard to top. And for me, it wasn't until No Good Deed that I really locked in for the second one. No One Mourns the Wicked in that first installment immediately draws us in to what the stakes are of the final installment. The first installment was fun and lighter, really about the discovery of their friendship. And Wicked for Good was just darker. In Wicked for Good, we tend to see a lot of repetition, whether that's lines that we're experiencing with a new perspective that are said back to different characters, or just simply in versions of the songs. So for example, we have Madame Morrible, who originally said in that first one that she doesn't think that she has what it takes. And then Glinda at the end of Wicked for Good says the same thing to Madame Morrible. Prince Fiero had no remorse after ditching Glinda on their wedding day. Prince Fiero's character could have been more humane in how he handled his love for Elphaba. The way that he left Glinda high and dry on their wedding day was pretty brutal, and it felt like a really deep betrayal, which fed into Ariana Grande's character Glinda giving up Nessa. And although she didn't create the tornado that took out Nessa herself, she played a huge part in that happening. If Prince Fiero had been more honest about his feelings and really communicated his deep attraction, love, and commitment to Elphaba that's been prevalent from the beginning when they met in the woods, it would have felt more poetic and more deserving when they finally got together. Instead, we see how heartbroken this makes Glinda. It makes me Team Glinda in this one. On a sidebar, John M. Chu knows how to throw a wedding. Everything about the would have been wedding was so mystical, magical. The dress, the setting, the way it looked, it was just gorgeous. For Elphaba, on a subconscious level, she did go to Oz to disrupt that wedding. So much so that even her sister Nessa calls her out for it. And even if it was for show, obviously for Glinda, those feelings were always real. You know, in Wicked, the first one, she confessed that, oh, we're getting married, and she was so excited about it. She told Elphaba this, and Elphaba at no point ever mentioned her own feelings or even begged her to look inward and see if that connection was real, which makes sense why Glinda would feel blindsided by this moment. So as much as I wanted to celebrate the consummation of their love, it was tinged with this feeling of deeper betrayal for her best friend. However, comparatively, even though Elphaba stole her man, Glinda did play a huge part in the demise of her sister Nessa. Nessa's descent into her own madness and depravity is a good contrast to what Glinda could have been. Nessa essentially gets to the point where she is holding Bok captive and doesn't want him to leave. She's holding on to the idea of this love that they shared that was never real to begin with. And he becomes heartless, and he suffers the consequences of it. However, Glinda was not doing the same thing to Prince Fiero, which would have made more sense why maybe he was so abrupt to leave and so savage about it, if in fact he was being treated the same way that Bok was being treated by Nessa. However, Glinda genuinely loved Fiero, but she was blinded by her ambition and position that she felt like she was supposed to inherit. Ariana genuinely gave it her all. She was so captivating in this role, so raw with her emotion, that it was through her perspective that I felt that emotional pull that made me cry. Wicked for Good is genuinely a tragedy. Once the wizard learns that Elphaba is actually his daughter, it's too late. Nessa loses her innocence, and so does Bok. And there was no real justice for Bok's character. He kind of just went bad and became the Tin Man and had this heartless vengeance, but there was no real resolve with his character. Prince Fiero breaks Glinda's heart, turns into a scarecrow, and Madame Morrible makes choices that she cannot come back from. The scene when Dorothy takes out Elphaba with the bucket of water, we only see it through shadows on the wall. Initially, I was wanting to see more of this scene. I thought that it could have been filmed in a more dynamic way. But once we get to the ending, we see that there's a reason for that. While Elphaba lives, her legacy doesn't. Elphaba remains the villain so that Glinda can be seen as the face of good. Within this universe and within Oz, we've only been introduced to two magical beings: Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, and Madame Morrible. Now, Madame Morrible has been a puppeteer from the beginning. Madame Morrible has been wicked from the beginning and throughout the second film. In fact, Madame Morrible is the one that creates the storm that eventually leads to Nessa's death. And it's through her actions that set off a chain of events. Bok becoming the Tin Man, Glinda losing her love and her best friend, and the wizard being exiled. And while we get glimmers of colorful fun, Wicked for Good is dark. Madame Morrible is the true wicked witch, but there's no justice for the wicked. I would have loved to have seen a conclusion where our two most powerful magical beings, Elphaba and Madame Morrible, went head to head. And that's where a musical adaptation written for the screen could have leaned into the cinematic scope, where we could have had a magical standoff between Madame Morrible and Elphaba when she's in her wicked era. I think a magical fight between Elphaba and Madame Morrible would have made this musical adaptation larger than life in a completely different way that we've seen. All that being said, I know it's based on a play, which is based on a book, but I think if we were going to take some creative liberties, that would have been my main note, was to see the two most powerful beings go head to head so we can get some justice for the characters that suffered a tragic ending. Wicked for Good is fantastic, but the first installment is better.